What's up, everybody? I'm Aura Elavinu with Fully Deconverted, and today we're going to be talking about the story of life with Thomas Westbrook from Holy Koolaid. Before we do, I just want to let everybody know that fullydeconverted.com is now live. So you can go head over there, check it out. We're going to be adding a lot of great content there, including a members area. So we got a lot of great original content. We have an article up on there right now. Go check that out. It's called Pascal's Holy Casino. And what else? Okay, R and Raw season finale is starting tomorrow. Or I should say ending, really, that whole series. And then other than that, you can find Fully Deconverted on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook for some great discussion, and Anchor for podcasting, if that's your thing. So without anything else, let's jump over to Holy Koolaid's Thomas Westbrook. Thomas, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you got going on.
So my name's Thomas Westbrook, obviously, and I do videos on Holy Koolaid that are short, animated, fun, hopefully to the point. I try to keep them laser focused because I don't like it when people waste my time, so I don't want to waste theirs. And I throw in a little bit of humor, a little bit of, kind of thought-provoking things from anything from philosophy to science, and try to explain just about anything, but mostly I kind of keep it related to religions, cult-like manipulation tactics that organizations will use to try to control people, and how we can think critically to make the world a better place, a more rational, skeptical place. So I'll break down the claims of the paranormal, psychic phenomenon, and I'll apply like a scientific skeptical lens to it. I'll look at claims by, people who are pushing for like the flat earth movement. And lately I've been going after the young earth creationist notion that the earth was created 6,000 years ago by really walking through the steps of abiogenesis and kind of showing how life could arise from simple chemistry. And it's been a lot of fun so far.
All right. First of all, your videos are amazing. How long does it take to produce one of those?
It depends on the video. If it's some of my atheist rants where I just have a topic that I really need to get off my chest and I'm just like, flowing. I don't know if I can swear on your channel, but
yeah, I guess you can.
if I just need to bitch about something,
yeah,
then those videos are pretty easy to make because usually I'll sit down and I'm already like worked up and I just like get down at the keyboard and I just like start typing something out and throw in a few little one-liners that are kind of catchy. And then those ones, like the animation's usually really simple. I'll just have myself like floating through space from like point A to point B while I'm like every once in a while throwing up a little image or a picture or some B-roll footage, video footage. But for the most part, I take at least a week, sometimes 3 or 4 weeks for a video. But I'll kind of mix some of the easier to make videos in there too, so I'm putting out regular content.
Yeah. What got you started in Holy Koolaid, and what's your vision behind it?
Well, initially I've got over 10 years of experience with video editing and content creation, a little bit less when it comes to the marketing side of it. But I had this skill set and I had done some different film competitions in college. I put together my first videos were stop motion Lego videos that were a lot of fun.
I always wanted to do that, by the way, stop motion, just try my hand at it. But like, I did it one time.
Long.
Yes.
You have to have the patience of a saint. And I don't know how I do it because I'm ADD as hell.
Yeah.
But I kind of had a little bit of a background with that. I never really had the equipment. And then I started realizing that, the cost of technology is coming down and down and down. I got a job in IT, so I had a little bit of money. But then I also realized like smartphones have good cameras, webcams now. You can get, full HD ones for under $100. And the biggest thing is the mic. And I realized like I had all the equipment or I could afford the equipment. And so I just started making videos about my journey, my thought process, coming a super fundamentalist religious background where my parents did missions work. And I was a missionary kid, a youth pastor. I did all of it. I was a church camp counselor. And as I wrestled with these questions, as I fell in love with science, I started to see that a lot of the claims that were put forth from, my religious background, that they didn't add up. And so I started to kind of dig a little deeper, thinking that truth withstood scrutiny, and eventually, as I scrutinized, it kind of fell apart, and I figured there's probably something to this. It's not true. It's not what everyone is saying that it is. And
Mm.
that's how I kind of got into making videos. Is I wanted to go where the truth led, but I realized a lot of my family would probably ostracize me for it. I realized that a lot of my friends would shun me for it, and I don't think that that's okay. I think that um, atheists are just normal people. They've been denigrated for so long from the pulpit and by pastors and preachers and whatnot, and we shouldn't have to face that kind of stigma.
I
And so I
regularly get told that I'm part of the devil's handiwork.
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of push back against that and show that, there are atheists who are angry. And I think that kind of the first wave of, as this was normalized, like post 9/11, you had a lot of people like coming out and they were just pissed off. And they're like,
Yeah.
I've been an atheist this whole time and I've had to hide it. And they were kind of frustrated. There were people who were kind of depressed because they were just emerging from, into atheism, and they were trying to find their footing. And there were a lot of people too who were genuinely cared about others, but they were pissed off and angry because they gave a damn. They saw people who were being hurt and who were being harmed. They saw a lot of the damage that was being done and caused by religion, and they wanted to speak out against it. But the only way that they knew to voice it was through rage and frustration. And I've kind of wanted to offer an alternative approach where, yeah, that stuff does get my blood boiling, but I'm offering the approach of, yeah, the world sometimes is full of shit, but shit sometimes can be good fertilizer as fuel for change. And so I took it and I tried to show a more positive side, how you can find meaning as an atheist, how you can come out of the atheist closet and not alienate all your friends and family, not make some of the mistakes I did, how you can find purpose and joy and happiness, how this life is short, and that doesn't make it not worth anything. It makes the value of it so much greater, because
Exactly.
when you suddenly make it a limited finite resource, the value of it just goes through the roof. So we want to, live it up, make this life the best, make it longer, make it better, make it, the future better for all of humanity. And so I was trying to kind of offer that alternative approach. As far as atheism itself, I don't really care about atheism. I know that sounds crazy because I'm a secular activist, but like my first love is science. And I find myself, as much as I keep trying to pull away from just atheism itself, I don't want to be defined by a negative, by what I don't believe. But as much as I try to keep getting into science and showing people, the love of scientific skepticism, critical thinking, technological advancement, transhumanism, the future, I keep trying to push that. But every time I keep getting dragged back in, because you'll have like, oh, hey, there's this really cool advancement that we could have, this potential breakthrough in stem cell research. Oh, well, the government's going to ban, stem cell research in the US because, that's a sacred sperm in a petri dish. Or you'll have people's rights just being taken away. You have people all around me here in the South who are gay, lesbian, trans, bisexual, who are treated like second-class citizens. There are women who, maybe they were raped or something, or even if they weren't, but they have like, a fetus that's like a few weeks old, and it's like almost like not even visible, and yet they can't just like take a pill and pass this thing because like that's murder. And so they have to resort to all kinds of horrific alternatives, and you start seeing all these different things, like the Pope was saying that you shouldn't use condoms in Asian parts of Africa. You've got, and I studied international studies, so like I see this stuff and I see how it's affecting the global community. We're facing overpopulation crises. We're, trying to bring down the total fertility rates and help these countries rise out of poverty and empower women. And yet you see all kinds of different things that are put forth in the name of religion, that it's not all religious people, but they're put forth because of the religion, that is causing so much stagnation, technological stagnation, that's causing us to, even things like the denial of climate change. It kind of comes from this dominionist view of the earth and the environment. It's yours to conquer and use and do with as you will, and God would never let that happen, and man doesn't have that kind of power anyways to change the environment. And so you see us, instead of radically pushing for, breakthroughs in clean renewable energy, and rather than pushing for, longer lasting batteries and, more efficient solar cells and stuff, you see this this ideology that I know it's largely pushed by traditional oil companies and energy companies and stuff, but it's almost entirely, I see it coming from religious fundamentalist conservatives that are
Yeah.
are trying to deny that there's even climate change that's taking place, or at the very least denying that there's a human hand in it. And so like I see all of this and I'm like, guys, come on, like this is the 21st century. We could be so much further ahead if we really valued and put an emphasis on the things that matter, and that's scientific progress and research and development and advancement. And instead we're getting passed by every nation on earth pretty much, it seems, or it feels.
I hate that part. I hate it when when I see our comparisons and there's room for growth there that we could have already achieved over the decades, if not for some ideas taking control. Thomas, what are some of the ideas that are causing these stagnations? Why is the stagnation occurring?
I mean, part of it I touched on, like with the climate change, is kind of this dominionist view of the earth. And well, Jesus is coming back anyways, right? So we don't really need to plan too far ahead into the future because, we can sit here jerking off hoping for the new Armageddon.
Yeah.
And it's so short-sighted. It's so nearsighted. There's this idea that God is in control of everything, and so we don't need to worry about an asteroid wiping out all of humanity and destroying civilization. We don't really need to stretch out into the stars and search for alien life or search for habitable planets or anything because, well, this one is what God gave us, and so we got to stay put. You see these ideas all throughout the Bible when it comes to homosexuality is an abomination. That's not just Old Testament. You got that shit in Romans. You have ideas like a woman's place in the church. She's supposed to be silent. She's supposed to cover her head. It's a very sexist viewpoint when it comes to gender equality. And so all of this, and even these ideas like be fruitful and multiply, it's literally in Genesis, it's talking about like you're just supposed to go out and have as many babies as you can. You're a baby factory. And I know that you're going to have people that say, well, I'm a Christian and I don't believe that literalist position. You have people who are moderates. They're very nominal Christians. But to those people, I would say, like, if you really break down the fundamentals, the literal interpretation of a book that claims to be perfect, and you start to see all of these ideas coming from it, sourcing from it, that people are using to push political positions, to push certain laws that are harmful to various either minority groups or the human population as a whole. And you cannot deny that the basis of it is entirely scriptural. So
Yeah.
they may not, most Christians even may not be fundamentalists. They may not be literalists, but the problem still lies with the fundamentals of the book itself. This is a book that, I could literally go into a library and pull any book from random off of the shelf. And if it was written in the 21st century, chances are that it has a massive amount of knowledge that the Bible would be completely void of, because they didn't know fuck all about this stuff. They don't have the slightest clue about, I'm not just talking about like quantum mechanics. I'm talking about, even just the fact that, the earth is, the solar system is heliocentric. There's an idea, like very basic things that we take for granted that, 2,000, 3,000 years ago were completely non-thinkable. Even they were, sometimes worthy of a death sentence if you were to tout ideas that were heretical or non-canonical. So for people who are nominal, that's great. I wish there were more people like you. But the fact is, we have tons of fundamentalists, especially here in the South. I lived in Texas. I'm in Oklahoma right now. I've been all throughout, Alabama and, Louisiana and whatnot, and like Mississippi. And these are the areas that are voting for politicians that push a hardline literalist creationist, usually young earth creationist, deny evolution, deny climate change. And we're really starting to suffer from it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it sounds like you're right there in the epicenter of all that.
Oh yeah, and I keep talking about how like my first love isn't atheism. It's not that like I'm just so excited about not believing in God. It's that when I was in College Station, I was at Texas A&M, and I had all these ideas for tech startup ideas that I wanted to, do, that I wanted to implement, that, and I would go to coffee shops and I'd be like, just looking around me, like, where are all the other developers? Where are all the other people who are excited about, changing the world and stuff? And there's like, there was nothing. There was no, like, I had to go and seek out startup groups. And even then it's like a bunch of old people who are maybe doing like real estate investing or something.
Yeah.
And I was frustrated because I saw what was going on in other countries, in places that were a little bit more liberal minded, places like Silicon Valley. And I saw entrepreneurs that were literally changing the world, and almost all of them were atheists. You had people like Richard Branson and Elon Musk and Steve Wozniak and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, who I know Zuckerberg has kind of flip-flopped a little bit, but at least they said, like, I'm agnostic, or I'm, Zuckerberg, I think, is like some weird secular kind of believes in God, and like almost, I don't even know, but pretty much all of them, like, these aren't fundamentalist religious Christians. These are people who, like, they're trying to save the world for humanity because they're humanists, because they care about the future of humanity, And so I just found myself yearning for more of this, to be surrounded with more people like that, and I couldn't find them. And so I'd go to coffee shops and I'd just hear people like sitting down and having Bible studies, Jesus, Jesus, God, God, and it's all talking about this stuff that's complete bullshit, and that is demonstrable bullshit. And it's just, it would start to like get under my skin, and I got to the point where like I couldn't take it anymore, and I was like, why is no one talking about this stuff? So I started making videos, debunking it, showing the science behind it, showing how science worked. And what I found was that there were a lot of people who were not only frustrated like me, but there were also a lot of people who this was new to them. Like, they'd never even heard this stuff before. And so for someone to kind of get on, YouTube and just start talking about, I know that there's other channels that do this too. I'm not the only one, but to many of them, like, I was kind of their introduction to it. And they started realizing that, oh my God, this stuff that I've never questioned, like, why do I believe that? Like, why do I actually buy into it? Like, what if there is an alternative that's actually true and this isn't? And I think that a lot of people are slowly starting to wake up, but we have our road cut out for us. We have a lot of work left to do.
What, in short, why do people believe ancient literature that asserts claims that aren't evidently true?
Well, the older it is, the harder it is to disprove, for one. So if you look back at, Mormonism, there's a growing, a growing number of Mormons, but most of us can look at it and be like, oh, come on. Like, Joseph Smith is obviously a con man. Like, you just a Google search of his name or watch an episode of South Park or something, like, but that's a newer religion. You look even closer to modern day, you look at something like Scientology. And yeah, there's a few followers here and there, and they use some different manipulation tactics. It's a cult. They're trying to pull people in. But you look at Scientology, and it's like, it's even more obvious that it's a cult. You look at people who, like Satya Sai Baba, he was like an Indian guru who, apparently could do miracles and pull pellets of, dust or smoke or ash or something from thin air, and predicted his own death, got it wrong. We've got it like all on videotape. We got people debunking it. He doesn't even merit like an hour on the Discovery Channel because it's so obviously fake. And yet this is a guy who he allegedly was doing all these miracles, but you push it back 2,000 years and you can't prove that. You have, you got all these eyewitness testimonies. Well, there's eyewitness testimonies who think that they saw aliens, that think that they saw Bigfoot and Elvis and the Loch Ness Monster and all this other stuff. But we don't take that seriously. But you push it back 2,000 years, it's like, oh, well, I heard that someone was willing to die for it. We don't have firsthand accounts. We have, books from anonymous authors, even biblical scholars, say, oh, it wasn't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And our earliest full Gospels come quite a bit after the death of Christ. The earliest tiny little fragments are like 50 years after the death of Christ. But all of a sudden it's believable because it's 2,000 years ago and somebody said it, and it's been passed down from generation to generation and so heavily ingrained in us. We're taught from the time that before we develop critical thinking skills, before our prefrontal cortex is even fully formed, and we're pushing that, indoctrinating that into our children. Of course, they're going to grow up thinking that that's the way that the world works, if that's all that they know, and if no one's stopping to question it. But just the fact that a lot of people believe it doesn't make it true. There's a lot of people that believe Islam. There's a lot of people that believe Hinduism. They can't all be right.
Okay, so just speaking to my own communities, I'm sure we all have our own religious communities that we come from, if we do. And it's astounding to me as I traveled around the world a little bit to other countries, and I would look at the host nation that I was in, and I would see all their people. And, maybe I'd be on a hill or a mountain just looking down, because that somehow makes the sense of what you're experiencing a little bit more profound, right? And I'm thinking, none of these people believe what I believe. I'm a former Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, how do you convince them? How do you tell everybody? And they've got their own thing going. Wait a minute. They believe the same way that I believe, and it's just based off of belief. So what makes that different? And it's amazing to me that doesn't actually go through the mind of many of us. In fact, I think we're often encouraged not to scrutinize our ideas. And but you are now producing a series called The Story of Life. What is that specifically about? What's the purpose of that series? What are you accomplishing here?
I've wanted to make this series since before I started my channel, started making videos. Even maybe while I was still a Christian, I wanted to, when I was still a Christian, I wanted to do it from the opposite viewpoint, where it was like, man, there's all these people that they don't believe in God and they believe in evolution, and I'm going to set out to prove to them, to show them that they're wrong. I'm going to make a video and it's going to, show all the evidence for God and stuff. And it was kind of in the back of my head. I didn't know if I would ever actually do it, but I just started kind of researching just for fun. And as I dove into the science, then I realized I was wrong. But once I became an atheist, I was like, I think that the biggest steps for me in accepting evolution and abiogenesis and the Big Bang Theory and whatnot was understanding how it worked. And I think there are so many people that just think that science operates the same way that religious dogma does, where there's a scientific establishment and they say that this is fact and you don't question it. And in all actuality, it's the complete opposite. In the scientific world, you win Nobel Prizes if you're able to disprove the consensus, but you have to be able to demonstrate the evidence. You have to be able to set up a hypothesis that's disprovable, and then you try to disprove it. You don't try to prove it right. You try to prove it wrong. You test it and you see what are all the different ways that the data could be interpreted. Now let's test all those different ways and try to disprove and falsify them and see what's left over. And the more evidence that you have behind certain ideas and the more that you have disproving other ones, you start to kind of get a better idea of the truth, and you start to kind of shape this idea. So the more that I dove into it, I started realizing that there's not only a lot of evidence behind this, but there's a lot of experiments that have been done. There's a lot of puzzle pieces that we put together. And when a scientist says we don't know where life or how life got here, they're not saying we don't have the slightest clue. They're saying we actually have a number of competing hypotheses, and there is a ton of evidence. We know that we're here, and we know a lot of these steps along the way, but there's a few little gaps here and there that we're still trying to kind of figure out. But you don't have to have the entire puzzle to get a pretty good idea of what the picture's of if you're missing just a few pieces. If you've got a puzzle that's like a puzzle of a dragon and you're missing like one piece in the corner, you're not going to say, oh, well, that's a picture of a boat. You have a pretty good idea.
Dragon.
You have a pretty good idea of the overall picture, even if you're like, well, I'm not exactly sure what goes right there in the corner, and that's kind of what we're looking at here is that, we know that we're all made of chemicals. We can examine our cells under, electron microscopes, and we can, figure out what we're made of and mass spectrometers and stuff. And we can look at, how our cells work and what all they're composed of and stuff. And we can compare that to other organisms. We can sequence the DNA and see, how similar we are to other animals and plants on Earth. We can compare, the anatomy and the structures of us and all these other animals. We can look back through the geological plates and stuff and trace it back through time and see where did certain organisms die off? Where did they, kind of emerge and evolve? How similar are they? We can date that radiometrically, and we can take all these different lines of evidence, and then we can start looking all the way back at the very beginning and be like, before this point, there's no fossils. Before this point, there's no chemical signatures for life whatsoever. And so we can kind of get back to the earliest life forms and the earliest fossils and the earliest signs of life, and then be like, well, what was before that? Okay, well, we can kind of get an idea of what the chemical atmosphere of the early Earth looked like by analyzing these ancient rocks and what's inside of them and stuff. We can, study outer space and different, like what chemicals are common throughout outer space on early planets that are forming through, accretion and whatnot, through like spectrographs. We can start gathering all these little bits of evidence and then be like, okay, well, if the early Earth was composed of, these chemicals, then is it possible to get from those chemicals to life? And so they'll set up these experiments that, they'll be in a very sterile environment where they just make it like exactly like the early Earth without any of the other stuff that we have around us today, because that wouldn't exist back then. Life wouldn't have existed before life existed. I know that, sounds obvious, but so then you can start with those simulations and start watching and seeing what happens on its own. If I don't interfere with it, if I'm not, trying to alter it or change it in any way, if I just set it up like a normal experiment where it's just let it run, what happens? And they've done experiments where they'll simulate the water cycle, they'll simulate lightning, they'll simulate volcanic activity, they'll simulate meteor impacts. And in all of these situations, they start seeing, the rise of amino acids, the rise of nucleic acids, fatty acids forming on like montmorillonite clay, and like all these building blocks for life. Like that's not life by itself, but those are the building blocks that will then make proteins and DNA and RNA and the fatty acid membranes, which then you have all this together. It can start to evolve, and you can start to get phospholipid bilayers and stuff, and you start seeing it all come together just on its own. Like just completely through chemical processes, chemical reactions. Certain molecules have positive charges, certain ones have negative charges. They attract to each other, like they'll form different types of bonds, and you start seeing this all happening through chemistry. And it's mind-blowing seeing that like you don't have to have someone putting it all together. It happens on its own. You give it enough time and it all starts to come together on its own. And so my whole purpose with the Story of Life series is to show how you can get from simple chemistry through chemical evolution to something that kind of resembles an early protocell, and then it starts to have mutations and it starts going through biological evolution and becomes more and more complex and evolves more and more complex structures, and how it can get from that to what we have today. And so there's a lot of steps in between, and I'm not going to be able to cover all of them just because like that would take from now until like the end of the universe.
You're producing a whole series on this.
But yeah, I'm trying to kind of give like an eagle eye view where like at least the concepts can be understood clearly. So like if you're, a high school kid or something, or a junior high kid, and you don't have like a super intense understanding of how biochemistry works, but you watch this video, you could be like, oh, hey, that kind of makes sense. Like, these are the experiments that kind of gave evidence for it. This is why we know, this is how we know that this is what happened. But I want to kind of go all the way, not just from chemistry, like eventually I want to go back and look at like the Big Bang, and I want to look at virtual particles and particle physics and how you can have particles arise from, matter coming from non-matter. And then what we know about the cosmos at the time of the Big Bang through studying like cosmic microwave background radiation. I want to look at how stars form. The quick and skinny of that is basically all you need is hydrogen, gravity, and time. And if you have enough hydrogen, it all starts to kind of come together because of gravity. And then you have so much pressure, it's pushing against itself, and it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And eventually it ignites and you have a star that forms. And then all of this pressure and heat and stuff, you start to see fusion where all of these simple elements start fusing into more and more complex ones. And we observe this happening literally all throughout our galaxy, all throughout the universe, through spectrographs. You can look at the light signatures and see like what percentage of the stars are made of different elements. And so,
Thomas,
I hope I'm not getting too technical here, but
yeah, no. So catch your breath. I'm going to take you back just a little bit. Okay. Let's go back to life. Let's go back to simple things becoming a little bit more complicated. Do I understand you correctly that if we go back however many million years, maybe a couple billion, maybe 3 billion, something like that, that if we were to act as an observer, we would see very simple chemical processes take place that start to form things like these nucleic acids or amino acids that you're talking about, I mean, from scratch. And then they just start assimilating. And especially if you're kind of a Christian who is interested in science, you might be, viewing some of this Christian science that talks about how everything is so finely tuned and well designed. that only God could have done this. But Thomas, are you sharing with me right now that these things happened simply and became more complicated, and that we've actually produced this in labs?
I don't want to say simply.
Okay.
But
yeah,
it
okay.
happened. It occurred naturally.
Gotcha.
And if you start going back and examining it, it's like one of those things where we know what organisms are made of now, and we can kind of start breaking it down into the fundamental building blocks. But how it got from those building blocks to where we are now, that's the mystery. Like that, those are the puzzle pieces we're putting together.
Yeah. Work in progress still.
But everything that we've observed so far indicates that this happens on its own. This happens completely naturally. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I'm not just kind of saying it happens with no evidence. So the most famous example, and also the one that creationists tend to get the most angry about and try to like dispute, but I'll kind of deal with some of the rebuttals here in a second, but is the Miller-Urey experiment, which was in kind of the early to mid 1900s, where there was this theory that like, hey, if you have kind of a warm little pond, sort of like Charles Darwin talked about, like Alexander Oparin talked about, you could have, these simple organic molecules like carbon, hydrogen, you can maybe have a little bit more complex like methane or something like that. And this is all stuff that's all throughout our universe. Like it's not uncommon at all. Yeah. And you could have that slowly form into the, organic building blocks of life, like amino acids. Okay. So Miller and the Stanley Miller and Harold Urey came along and put together this experiment where they had this glass contraption where they had water that there was a heat source that would kind of evaporate the water. And then it would go through this tube, and it would mix with like this gas. I think they had ammonia, methane, and H2O, and I forget what the fourth one was, but I think carbon dioxide, or maybe it was carbon monoxide. Just really simple gases that are all around us, right? And then they added a spark, which would simulate lightning, which really wouldn't be that uncommon to have in an early Earth-like scenario. And what they found is then they would have it condense, and it would become water, the gas would become water, and then it would go back up in the cycle. So just imitating the water cycle. Like they're not adding any other like crazy chemicals or any man-made aspects to it. They're just trying to kind of observe it. And what they found was after just a couple of days, it formed amino acids.
Okay. All right. Stop right there. Stop right there. That already, to me, is crazy coming from a religious background. If you're thinking, nah, nothing can happen, no building blocks whatsoever without an intelligent designer, it must all be magic, whatever. But a few days and they start getting amino acids. All right, that's great. What is something that amino acids do, just so any viewers can kind of grasp what this is?
To give you an idea, on their own, amino acids, they don't really do anything.
All right, amino acids are killing. Okay.
They're the building blocks of proteins. And
so they make amino acids. Yeah, go ahead.
So they'll stack together. The amino acids will stack together into these long chains, right? Called polypeptide chains. Yeah. And those form proteins. Like they get longer and longer, and they form proteins, and they fold up into each other or on themselves and stuff. And you'll have proteins have all kinds of functions throughout the body. So you might have a transport protein that allows different molecules in and out of a cell wall. You might have a protein that gives structure or something, like kind of acts as a scaffolding or something for different parts of the body. You might have proteins that function like hemoglobin, which is like your red blood cells. That they have all different functions, but they're all composed of amino acids. And the organization, like the order, how they're all ordered, depends, like that determines how they'll fold, and it determines the function that they'll carry out.
That is, I don't know anything about this. This is not a part of my academic training at all. So I love hearing about this, and it just blows my mind. I feel like you say one thing and I need to go take a college course on this. But So you got amino
That's why it's
acids.
been 3 weeks since I released my last video, is I've just been burying myself in like the scientific research, and I'll write up a script and I'm like, I think that this is perfect. There's no problems with it. And I'll send it off
Yeah.
to a couple biochemists for peer review. And they're like, oh no, that's wrong. And that's wrong. And then I've got to go back and research and double check. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. All right. Well, okay. So we have amino acids that are
Okay.
developing into proteins, and and these somehow are making up some labor force that are making things happen. Okay. This is Aura L's explanation, and but you mentioned cells and that sort of thing. So so we start making amino acids, and then how do we get to a cell? Are you that far along yet? And
yeah. So I've gotten. The thing is, the boundary for like life and non-life, it's not as black and white as you would think.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. So if you look at a virus, is a virus alive?
I don't know.
So a virus is able to reproduce, but it reproduces using your cells because it doesn't have its own DNA. But it does have RNA, so it can like basically latch onto your cells and implant its RNA into you and use your cells to reproduce itself and make a ton of more like little viruses, right? Yeah. But it's very simple. Like it doesn't have, the membrane bound organelles of like a prokaryote. It doesn't have like the DNA that we would expect in like a wait, which one did I say? Eukaryote, prokaryote. It doesn't have what you would expect to be in a cell. And so when you start looking at the earliest cells, like there's a couple of different hypotheses. And this is where like when scientists say we don't know exactly how it got here, it's because they start getting back into like these really complicated alternatives. So like we know that all of our bodies have RNA. We know that really simple things like viruses only have RNA. And we know that RNA can on its own in certain circumstances, that it can self-replicate, that it can have, the different building blocks, the nucleotides, or the ribonucleotide bases pair up and line up next to it on their own. It can fold in on itself and form ribozymes that can really do a lot of the functions that you would expect from like proteins and stuff.
We're talking Transformers here.
Well, so when a scientist says we don't know exactly how it happened, they're like, well, we have some pretty good evidence to think that the early world was made of RNA. But it might not have been. It might have been that, it might have been proto-RNA, where instead of like the usual, adenine, guanine, cytosine and uracil, then what if like one of them was a little bit different, had a tiny bit different chemical backbone or a tiny bit different base or something like, and then it evolved over time. Like, so you have these different variations of RNA, proto-RNA, like there's different ideas and hypotheses that they're putting forth, but that doesn't mean that this stuff doesn't occur naturally in nature. It doesn't mean that our bodies aren't made up of it. It doesn't mean that we're not made of chemistry. It just means that like they don't know beyond a shadow of a doubt. They just have a couple of competing hypotheses that they're still trying to kind of figure out which ones are the most plausible.
Yeah.
So
okay. All right. Well, you just feel okay. All right.
So you're wondering now how we get from amino acids to cells.
Yeah. I don't know if you've made it this far. I watched 2. You only have 2 videos out right now, right?
I'm working on my 3rd one, and I'm hoping to have it out by Saturday, but we'll see.
Okay. So what I got so far from your videos is basically what you and we've talked about right now. And I'm wondering how we make that leap into something that we call life, but you're kind of addressing that right now in viruses. Viruses. Hey, I don't have a definition of life anymore ever since I deconverted. Like, I just don't got that anymore. So I think if something is moving and functioning, that's where we start. And now I'm just wondering, hey, what are your thoughts on, does any of this exist outside of Earth? Have you thought of that?
Yeah, well, we found those same amino acids we've observed in outer space. And we've seen like meteorites, like the Murchison meteorite that landed in Australia.
How
And
long
they
ago? What was that?
this was, I want to say like 1960 something. I could be off by a decade or two, but I think it was around the 1960s. And they found amino acids inside this meteorite. So they're like, whoa, like those exist even out there. And then like they started, observing them in outer space as well. And so
What,
then
like floating around in the atmosphere, or?
I want to say that they've done analyses of, because like we've landed like probes on like comets and stuff like that. And I want to say that they've done analyses on those. Don't quote me on that. I could be wrong.
Right.
I don't know if you can observe them through spectrographs. It might just be through meteors or meteorites that land that we observe.
But amino acids.
But yeah. But another thing we've done is we've taken basically meteorites and that have, some different amino acids in them and stuff, and nucleic acids and whatnot. And we've done simulations where we just like smash it against, like we'll have these cannons, these guns that like shoot it at like outrageous speeds, right? In little machines. And they'll see like, does that destroy the amino acids? Is it possible that there's somewhere, different areas, different parts of space where this stuff forms so much easier on its own, and then maybe these meteorites carried all the amino acids to Earth? Because like you look at Earth's history, and you look at you drill down into the layers of the Earth, and you start to realize like there's different points where the Earth was under a ton of bombardment from outer space, because there's different chemical signatures that are left over when that happens.
Do we have a time frame on that?
So I'm mostly talking about the late heavy bombardment, and I want to say that was between 4.1 years ago. So right about the time that the earliest life forms are starting to show up was about 3.8 billion years ago, maybe a tiny bit earlier.
So we're speculating that perhaps something might have came in. We're talking like something like panspermia.
Yeah, so I mean, it wouldn't be like a living organism, because no living organism is going to survive a meteor impact. But they're wanting to see like, do these amino acids, do they just get vaporized? Do they get destroyed and broken down into their chemical parts? Or what happens when an asteroid hits the Earth? And what they found was that when they launched these cannons that just fire it at such a rapid pace, like you'd think it would just like destroy it all. Instead, what happens is they start forming into like more complex organic molecules. Like they get even more complicated. So it's like these they're so much more resilient than we thought. And you start to see like these nucleic acids forming, these amino acids are forming into like more complex chains and stuff, and it's just mind blowing.
Okay, that is okay. All right, let's stop right there and let's just zoom around in our heads for a second. How does this mechanism, how is this achieved in our universe? I don't even know what kind of question I'm asking right here. That we go from the best we understand of whatever our current version of the Big Bang is right now, whatever, to seeing the universe as it is, drawing deductions about everything that happened in between, and having good evidence and whatever we all have for it. And then we take this shift from just matter to matter with an operational manual or some operation. Where does this take your mind? Because this to me sounds like something which creationists would say, we're observing these things because the creator, our deity has put these things in place. Where does your mind go?
You have to be careful with this, because like if you start thinking about like the anthropic principle or something, which I think I'm saying this right, but basically it's that people say like, well, why is there life on Earth? Like it must be, that it was intelligent design, because the odds of it happening are so small. But you look at it and you're like, well, of course you would find life in the one place that has life permitting options. So like if there's hundreds and hundreds of billions of stars, potentially like, trillions upon trillions upon trillions of different, I think like the average galaxy has like 100 billion to 400 billion stars. And we have like over 100 billion galaxies that we know about. And the universe we found out was like 10 times bigger than we thought like 2 years ago. And then, you realize that we only can see out to around, I think what is it, 13 point something billion years in all directions, which is like the observable universe, because that's like how far light has traveled since the start of the universe. But like it could be way bigger than that. And so it's like, if the universe is infinite, or if it's even just mind-bogglingly stupidly big, then every possible thing that can happen eventually will happen. So if, like, even if life is extremely unlikely, if it's possible that it can come about, then it will. But what we're finding is that a lot of this stuff, like the laws of physics and the laws of nature, like, they do permit for life to happen. Now, it's possible that there's other universes out there that have different laws of physics. If that's the case, they may be laws of physics that allow for much more life to much easier, come about much easier than they do here. Or it might be completely impossible altogether. And that might be determined by the shape of different universes and stuff. I don't know. Like, that's where, like, I'm outside my realm of I don't even want to say expertise, because I'm by no means an expert in this, but
so right now, this is what I'm comprehending. Maybe our definition of life, while we take it sacred to mean a certain thing, maybe what we're referring to when we say the word life is just the process that we've been describing all along. And then if we're to take another concept that's just as intriguing and couple that with life, and that concept is intelligence, consciousness, data processing, and we merge these two together, we maybe then at that point tend to think only humans, only our kind of life could have come from something special or whatever, or it could not have come from these natural processes that occur in the universe. But maybe, yes, actually they do. And the universe does conduct processes just that way. And once you reach a certain limit, or on whatever gradient or spectrum, however you want to call it, that consciousness or, life, intelligence, whatever, just grows until we find ourselves talking about the process itself and wondering, wow, how long did it take to get here? That's where I'm at on that.
There's a couple things to unwrap there. Is that, one, we do tend to be extremely egocentric, and we do tend to think like, oh, I'm the smartest, I must be special. And yet we have so many different cognitive biases and self-delusions, and we have so many different cognitive failures when it comes to processing something as big and mind-numbing, for all kinds of logical fallacies. And when you actually start to kind of break it down and you compare our brain to, say, a chimp's brain or an elephant's brain or a dolphin or something, there's not a whole lot of difference. It's like, oh, well, this particular tiny little region has specialized and this particular region is 20% bigger, but it's like, it's all the same DNA underlying it. It's like just organized a tiny bit differently. And it's, if you think that, what if evolution continues at the same rate, or, in the same direction, to be 10% smarter, some however many million years from now, would we look back on ourselves then and be like, oh, well, they weren't really intelligent, conscious entities. Like, it's okay to like butcher them alive and eat them. Like, they're just bacon, But I think the other thing to look at too is that, like, we tend to say, like, look, life is so advanced and amazing and evolved, it must be designed. But if you think about it, like, the universe doesn't give a shit about you. It's trying to wipe you out. Our main source of light gives us cancer. Think about that. And so you start to kind of open this up and you're like, oh my God, like, it's not that the universe is designed for me. It's that, like, my ancestors have fought tooth and nail, and all the ones that didn't adapt got wiped out off the face of the planet.
Yes.
So all of these processes, and I'm going to get into this more in my next video, is kind of how natural selection really starts to play a role as these tiny little vesicles that, they have a little DNA inside them. They don't seem like they're much. They just have a little fatty acid membrane or something. But all of a sudden, they start developing tiny little advantages that allow them to like steal fatty acids from their neighbors.
Yeah.
And they're literally, they're growing by eating the people around them, like, or not the people, but like the little vesicles around them. And so it's like, well, I'll take that and I'll take that. And like the ones that get better at that come to dominate the population. And then they're able to reproduce more in their genetic content. And then the ones that have little mutations that make them a little bit better, suddenly they're top of the food chain. And there's this arms race that's just going on. And then you have the environment that's trying to destroy them and kill them. And the ones that survive just barely, like those are the ones that like they reproduce and they keep passing on their genes. And so you start seeing this complexity just naturally arising because the ones that aren't able to adapt get wiped out. Like it's a very natural process. And it seems like it's like, oh, there's some puppet master guiding it. It's like, no, the puppet master is just like, hey, here's this random catastrophe that's trying to kill everything. And like, did anything survive? And there's probably, there was probably points where like something might have popped up and like before we think life emerged, something might have like started to pop up and then boom, everything just gets wiped out. And then like a little bit later, a few 100 million years, something else pops up and then it starts kind of reproducing. And then like we have different mass extinction events where you'll see like 95% of life gets just wiped out from like an asteroid impact that like almost sterilizes the earth. But there's like a few little organisms that survive and keep reproducing. And everything else is extinct. And so obviously like the ones that survive, like they're going to be more like better adapted to, to life on Earth. And, we think that we're so great, but you look at the tardigrade, which is this tiny little microscopic water bear or whatever. And this thing can take like massive doses of radiation. It can like adapt and like mutate on the fly and like it can survive in outer space. And,
that guy's been through it all.
Yeah. Like go without oxygen, go without food, like all this stuff. And then just like kind of pop back up and keep ticking. And you're like, holy crap. And I thought that like my life was impressive. Like this guy's been around a lot longer than me. He's way better, suited for his environment than we are.
They look ugly though.
I don't know.
I would tell you. I would tell you what I think they look like, but I'll save it. They look
you
like
cut out for half a second there.
Oh, that's cool. This wasn't going to be important anyways. All right. Hey, just a little trivia question here. All these mass extinction events, or even maybe like, 13,000, 15,000 years ago, when we might have had like this ice age flood or something that I've kind of heard about, but I haven't looked into any peer review articles on it. Do you think that there were species on this earth that were actually more advanced than you and I presently?
Define better, more advanced, like intellectually?
Yeah, intellectually, technologically.
Not technologically.
Gotcha.
If they were more technologically advanced than we are now, they would have left evidence. And I say that because like even if like let's say that all of humanity gets completely wiped off the face of the earth right now, then there are new materials that we've created that for hundreds of millions of years will take time to degrade and to, well, maybe, I don't know about hundreds of millions. Someone's going to fact check me, but but there are certain elements that have really, really high half-lives.
Yeah.
And they're, that we built. They're artificial materials and artificial elements that we've only synthesized. Like they don't form on their own in nature, but we're able to make them and develop them, intelligently, that, they're not just going to decay like in 100 years. They're not just going to go away in 1,000 years. Like there's going to be, if someone digs down far enough and they start kind of looking at the Earth's crust, they'll be like, well, what the hell is this? Like, this was like the age of the plastics, they're going to start seeing like these little remnants of society. And not just that, you look up in like outer space and we have all of these, satellites and stuff. There's just this thick, dense layer of debris, cosmic debris. And it's not really it's getting some cosmic radiation, but there's not like bacteria breaking down the metals or something up there, like it's up in a vacuum. It's going to last a little bit longer, I think. So,
all right, let me ask you this. Since this is what you're enthusiastic about and you have experience here, wondering why it's not any different. Can you be religious and learn everything about what you're talking about? Can you maintain the dogma of your religion?
It depends on the religion. And I say that because like the Dalai Lama has a quote where he said, if Buddhism were disproven by science, or if science were to disprove some tenet or element of Buddhism, Buddhism would have to change.
Mm.
And I think if you have a mindset like that, where it's like, you know what, like I have kind of a spiritual journey, maybe like I care about mindfulness, or I have certain tenets that a social code or something, or a moral framework that I call religion, but it's kind of open to change, then something like that, yeah, it's pretty resilient. Um, if you have a literalist, young earth creationist, 6,000-year-old ideology that's very literalist and dogmatic, something like that, like you have to put up walls and you have to kind of segment things and be like, all right, so I know that, my cell phone works, so I'm going to believe in a little bit of science. I'm going to believe that, scientists probably know a thing or two about quantum mechanics. Michael Faraday was probably right, there's, when it comes to electrical engineering, I'm going to accept all of that. And I'm going to accept, most of what we know about, radiation, except for radiometric dating, because the Earth isn't older than 6,000 years old. So they have to kind of cherry pick which elements of science they're going to accept and not, which is crazy because so often it's like the same things that they accept and use every day, they're denying when another area they're just completely ignorant or oblivious to the overlaps. And so something like that, in order to still be religious, like you have to go into it's all allegorical, or it's, science and religion. Well, science kind of tells you how it happened. Religion tells you why it happened. But that's just like, when you really start to break these claims down, they fall apart. Like I think it was Morgan Freeman that he said that for him, science and religion are trying to answer the same question, and Genesis and the Big Bang and stuff, like they're basically, one is explaining it from a scientific point of view, one's explaining it from a theological point of view. And that sounds all cool and whatnot until you start thinking and you're like, wait, but one of them is wrong.
Right, yeah,
like
right.
either the Earth popped into existence 6,000 years ago or it didn't. And
Yeah.
I can point to, I can grab this water and I can just dump it on the floor, and I can say, oh, well, it fell to the ground because, the laws of motion and gravity, and like I can explain it all scientifically. Or I can be like, it fell to the ground because, the angels were pushing it from the top down and making it hit the floor.
Yeah.
One of those explanations isn't right. And if you start accepting things without evidence, without any kind of empirical data, and if you just accept it point blank dogmatically because you were taught it, and not because you've set out to disprove it and you've gathered all the evidence and you compare the evidence, and maybe you're not an expert in all the fields, but you're like, all right, well, I'm not a physicist, but this guy is, and he's going to specialize in that, and I'm a chemist, so I'm going to specialize in chemistry, and this person's a archaeologist, and this person's and you have all these people specializing in all these different organizations all around the world. And then you're like, well, how can we make it even better? All right, well, let's have journals that scientific journals that are respectable, subscription based, that their entire reputation is based off of the quality of their publications, and they're going to have a team of experts that peer review the articles, and everyone's trying to disprove everyone else, and if you're successful, you get a Nobel Prize. It's like, yeah, that's not a perfect system. There's still a lot of change that, like, even in the last 100 years, different things that, like, the concept of peer review is like less than 200 years old. The concept of a meta-analysis, I think, came about in like the 1920s or 1930s. All this stuff is like, we're getting better and better tools for our tool set, but it's still the best we've got. No one has a scientific theory that they put forth that then someone comes along and says, well, I disprove that with my religious notions. Like that never happens. It's always like there's all these religious explanations that are not based in evidence, or that are based in shoddy evidence or something, or just intuition. And then someone comes along and says, well, I built a telescope. Let's go and see what let's go and actually examine, the orbit of Venus, or let's observe moons that are going around Jupiter or something. Like you always have like, it goes one way, and that's that, like, sometimes science doesn't have it quite right, or maybe it's off by like a little bit, and then like we adjust it a tiny bit to like fit the data. We get more data, we get better observations, we have better theories that explain more stuff that are stand up to scrutiny. And so like science is getting closer and closer and closer to the truth. it's not that like, oh, there's some longstanding, dogma in science and then like it's just completely thrown out. It's like, no, we have like the best understanding and then it gets like a little bit better and then a little bit better. And like it slowly gets tweaked. And it's always science that finds out where science got wrong. It's a self-correcting method. So
it's not human's enemy in any regard, even if you're religious. It can only help you and inform you.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best we've got when it comes to discovering the truth.
Yeah.
Because when you start thinking about like epistemology and like how we can know things, I could go and I could just like sit in a cave and just think about stuff. And, I might figure out a few things. I might kind of get into some deep philosophical territory. But when it comes to how the universe itself actually works, the best way to find that out is to test it. Is to get, you realize like, hey, maybe our eyes aren't the best thing. Well, okay, well, we have tools that can actually observe the universe in like infrared and ultraviolet. And we can look at like, microwaves and x-rays and all this stuff. And we've got tools that can see the super, super, super small. We've got these electron microscopes and we've got stuff that can, measure, gravitational waves. We build these gigantic tools and we have all these scientific equations that not only, are predictions of what we'll observe, and then the predictions come true, and we're like, maybe there's something to that based off of the data that we gather. But they're also they're predictive on like, hey, like the universe works, then we can expect that in exactly this amount of time there's going to be another solar eclipse. In exactly this amount of time, then this comet is going to return because it's going around the Earth at this angle at this speed. And this is how gravity works according to our equations. And if your equations are right, you'll see like 100 years later or however many years later, like it's going to return the exact same trajectory. And that's the power of science. That's the beauty of science, is that it has predictive capability. And if your predictions are wrong, well, it's falsified, or at least you got your numbers off by a little bit and you got to tweak your equation. So...
Thomas, it's been great talking to you. You and I met at the American Atheist convention over in Oklahoma City. And I had just come out as a non-believer. So you saw me right at that time. I just came out that week prior after I aired some documentary with my story in it. And so meeting you and everybody else was my first experience.
That's awesome.
Yeah, of an atheist community. We were hanging out there with Aaron Raw and a lot of people I didn't know, but I'm certain are well known. So it was a pleasure meeting you then. You were an awesome guy, and I appreciate the short talks you and I had at that point. I appreciate your expertise now and your love for science. Like, I love that that's your love.
I'm not an expert. I'm an enthusiast.
There you go.
Maybe one day I'll be an expert, but I just read a lot.
Well, you certainly helped me here, and all our audience base here over at Fully Deconverted. Tell people where they can go and find some more of your projects.
So my channel is called Holy Koolaid. HolyKoolaid.com is my website. It's got all my work there. That's where I'm doing my story of life, and I'll be releasing more videos in that. Eventually, I want to kind of make it into just one big movie that, cuts out all the fluff in the middle and just has like, this is where you send people if they're like, well, how did life come from non-life if not God? I'm trying to kind of get rid of those gaps and give them that resource. If you want to dive deeper into these ideas and go into like a long form discussion, an hour and a half long, I have a podcast called The Here and How, as in how do you do, not as in like the time now, but like The Here and How podcast. And you can find that on YouTube as well as thehereandhow.com. And that's with two fellow YouTubers, Rationality Rules, or Stephen Woodford, and Rachel Oates. So we have a lot of fun. We dive into everything from the future of artificial intelligence to exploring the ins and outs of evolution. And it's kind of, well, it'll do your head in sometimes because I've got two excellent co-hosts, and it's always a fun ride.
Sounds amazing. I'll make sure to link those on the website so other people going can reference those and check those out. Thomas, it's been great having you on. Say bye to everybody.
Absolutely. Take care, guys. Have a fantastic Wednesday. Yeah, it's Wednesday.
Yeah. Take care.